Welcome back. Father Walter here with Brother Hyacinth. We're at the high altar of St. Vincent Ferrer Church, and we've been examining the enamels of the Tabernacle as a way of preparing for the Mass of the Lord's Supper. And specifically, we've been looking at the left-hand door, which has scenes from the Old Testament, which give us sources for understanding the Eucharist and ways of recognizing Christ as the fulfillment of God's plan. So in our first episode, we spoke about the sacrifice of Abel, Abram's encounter with Melchizedek, and the offering, Abraham's offering of Isaac. So now we're at this second column of cloisonné enamels. Again, Old Testament instances that are going to give us ways of understanding the Eucharist we celebrate every day or every week. So we're looking here at Moses encountering the burning bush. So you remember that Moses was shepherding his father-in-law's sheep, and he saw a bush on fire but not being consumed. And he approached and he encountered there the living God. And we understand from this a couple of things. One, the ways in which we are being called into intimacy with God. So Moses gets close to the burning bush, he gets told to take his shoes off, but he's in fact communicating with the living God, having a conversation with him, and it's a conversation which changes history. Well, you also understand from this that God is beyond nature. God indeed is the manipulator of nature. So it's understanding that the Eucharist is both an intimate communion with God and also an experience in which God's intervention takes us beyond what nature itself understands in the transubstantiation of bread and wine. It's also true that with God, the bush is never exhausted. And likewise, we understand that the Eucharistic mystery is never exhausted, just like the love and the mercy and the healing power of Christ are never exhausted. Below this, we see the manna in the desert. You see here the manna on the ground and the Israelites gathering it up, and you see the basket there and the tents behind. So you see where you are and what they're doing. And the manna is literally bread from heaven. And so bread from heaven is one of the ways we understand the Eucharist, and we refer to it as such. But it also, the sign of the manna reveals something else. It reveals something that God does which nobody could ever expect. God gave the food out of the heavens as dew on the ground every day for the 40 years Israel walked through the desert. It never failed. It never failed. And so what we see is that this is a hint that God can do for us more than we even dare to ask. And the Eucharist is such a gift. It shows it is there for us every day, every week. And the second thing to mention is that the Israelites were only supposed to gather enough manna for the day. So each person filled their basket, and those who gathered a lot didn't have too much, and those who gathered little didn't have too little. God made it work. And so the Eucharist comes into each of us as a tangible expression and an effective sign of God's love, and it administers it to us, or through it God administers to us what we need. It interacts with the individuality of each person. And then below this, finally, we have an interesting scene. It's not so famous, but you have two soldiers eating bread in the center and on the right, and then on the left you have the priest in white with the breastplate there. So what that's a story of is that David and his soldiers were hungry and went to one of the temples, and in that temple they asked the priest for food, and the priest said, well, there is the bread before God, and they needed it, and he gave it to them. This is a story that Jesus cites when he and his disciples are walking through a field of grain on a Sabbath, and the disciples simply take some of the grain and eat it. And they're criticized for doing that on the Sabbath. And Jesus famously says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And then he quotes this story. It's an indication that the worship of God and all the appurtenances of worship do not benefit God. God did not need this bread that was put in front of him. But whatever we do in worship, whatever objects we use in worship, ultimately are for not satisfying God as much as nourishing us. And so the Sabbath then is for man. That is, the worship we carry out, our responding to God, doesn't meet a need of his. It meets our needs. Responding to God is a need we have, but also receiving from God is a need we have. So that this scene here is showing people benefiting directly from God's providence. Indeed, all three of these scenes, Moses before the burning bush, the Israelites gathering manna, David and his soldiers eating the showbread, recognize the providence of God attending people in need. And so, you and I, recognizing this in Holy Week, as we move through time, recognize that God in the Mass is providing the manna we need specifically in our wilderness at this time. Thank you so much.